In this second session, looking at 1 Chronicles, we're beginning with chapter 4. Now, it should be noted that we believe that Ezra the scribe was probably the person who collated all the information on the genealogies found in 1 and 2 Chronicles. This would have occurred after the exile to Babylon. By this time, many of the tribes in the north of the country had been lost to Assyria, so Ezra concentrates on the remaining tribes of Judah, which were Simeon, Benjamin, and Levi. Chapter 4 contains the famous prayer of Jabez in verse 10. But who was Jabez? We know very little about him, except that he was a man of impeccable character. He may have been a scholar or scribe. If the town of Jabez that is mentioned in 1 Chronicles chapter 2 verse 55 was named after him, that would seem to justify this assumption. We certainly know that he was a man of prayer, a humble man, and one that did not want his name to work against him. Jabez means sorrow, or he makes sorrowful. This man pushed into God and God blessed him despite the label that he had been given by others. That's a great lesson for us right there. In this chapter, we also learn about people with practical skills. Craftsmen in verse 14, linen workers, probably weavers in verse 21, and potters and gardeners in verse 23. Note that the potters and gardeners lived and worked for the king, just as our lives are set aside to live and work for King Jesus. You might also have noticed that Caleb is mentioned in verse 15 and that then his sons and descendants are listed. Joshua and Caleb were the only two of the older generation of Israelites that stood by God after spying out the promised land. They were the only two of that generation that made it into the promised land. Joshua led the people in, and Caleb remained as strong at age 80 as he was 40 years previously. In verse 18, a man called Mered, we are told, married a daughter of Pharaoh. So this puts the genealogy at this point in Egypt, around or just after the time of Joseph, when the Israelite people were still in favour with the Egyptians, before they became their slaves. And then, from verse 24 onwards, the genealogy then focuses on the tribe of Simeon. They occupied certain towns and villages for a season, but it seems that once David's reign was fully established, they moved around more, living a nomadic or semi-nomadic lifestyle, and that they separated into two different areas, some going to a valley south of Judah, to the region of Gerar, and some travelling to Mount Seir, where they drove off the Amalekites and settled down. The family tree continues in chapter 5, but the scribe also includes a few moral and spiritual lessons along the way. So right at the beginning of chapter 5, we're told about Reuben, who slept with his father's concubine. That sin caused him to lose his birthright. What do we learn from that? Sin has consequences not only for us, but also for our children and our children's children. Had he not sinned, perhaps Messiah would have come from his line of descendants instead of through the line of Judah. Another lesson we can learn from this chapter has to do with a people called the Hagrites. They were a nomadic people who were first routed by the Reubenites in verse 10, and then later by the Reubenites, Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh in verse 20. The Hagrites had at least 100,000 men, and the 2.5 tribes could only muster 44,760 men. But the Hagrites lost. Why? Because the 2.5 tribes cried out to God and put their trust in him. What do we learn from this? Prayer changes things. The odds may be against us, but we don't need to despair. If God is for us, then who can be against us? When we trust God, he moves on our behalf. Please note that they cried out to God. They were not quiet in their prayers. It's okay to make a noise when we find ourselves in difficult situations. But what was it that the Hagrites had done that ensured that so many of them died? We may not know for sure, but verse 22 tells us that God was fighting against them. Often, God is shown to fight against nations and tribes that live idolatrous lives or that have done ill towards his chosen nation. Unfortunately, the 2.5 tribes that had defeated them then went on to live idolatrous lives themselves, and the end of the chapter tells us that they ended up being overcome by the Assyrians. And so we learn another lesson. We must remain faithful to God. We cannot afford to rest on our laurels when we overcome an enemy. We need to continue to seek after God, remembering that he is the one that gives us the victory, and that without him, we are lost. And now we turn to chapter 6. Which gives the ancestral record of the priestly tribe of Levi. All priests had to be of the tribe of Levi, but not all Levites were priests. In addition, the high priests, who were the only ones allowed into the most holy place, had to be descendants of Aaron, Moses' brother. The Levites were not given a special tract of land, but were scattered throughout Israel to minister to the people on behalf of God and to minister to God on behalf of the people. Verses 54 to 81 lists the names of the cities that were designated to the Levites, and this list includes 6 cities of refuge where the role of the Levites would have been really important. This chapter also reveals the importance of worship, listing people appointed by David to lead the singing, as well as music directors and choir masters. And no doubt these names include many who were composers too. Amongst their numbers, 3 names in particular are mentioned. Heman, Samuel's grandson, who wrote Psalm 88. Asaph, a prophet and a psalmist. And Ethan, who wrote Psalm 89. These 3 each headed a temple choir and a family of singers and musicians. Now, having thoroughly covered the southern tribes in chapters 1 to 6, the scribe turns his attention to the northern tribes in chapter 7, thus creating a complete picture of the tribes of Israel. The chapter begins by telling us about the descendants of Issachar, Jacob's 9th son. One of the meanings of his name is his reward will come, and we quickly see that he is rewarded with a lot of descendants, until eventually in chapter 12 we discover that amongst the thousands of mighty men of valour that could be traced back to Issachar, there were at least 200 men of understanding of the times who knew what Israel ought to do and could therefore be raised up as competent leaders. That is a great reward. Who doesn't want their children and their descendants to lead well in life? Note that throughout this chapter the tribes are noted for the number of fighting men. This was important as they were entering the promised land and needed to fight for their God-given territory. In the same way, we are now called to wrestle in prayer to take territory for God. After Issachar, we see the descendants of Benjamin, who include Ehud in verse 10. You can learn about this left-handed man in the book of Judges, chapter 3. Later, we learn about the descendants of Manasseh, which includes someone called Zelophehad. He had no sons, so his daughters went to Moses to ask if they could receive an inheritance of land. In a patriarchal society, that was a radical request, and Moses had to seek God before answering the women. Oftentimes, we may not have an immediate answer to a problem, but we can learn from Moses and bring the issue to God, and he will give us the way forward. In verses 20 to 29, there is a touching story of real family tragedy, but there is also hope. After the devastating loss of sons, the father is grief-stricken, but eventually his granddaughter builds 3 towns. Don't overlook the significance of this. During a time when women were considered property of men, this woman commanded so much respect that men must have worked beside and under her authority to establish these towns. And these towns seem to have been of some significance, since they are mentioned elsewhere in Scripture. And at least one of them was rebuilt, so God protected the legacy of her work for hundreds of years. Thus, chapter 7 highlights women who did not allow their gender to stand in the way of either their God-given calling or their inheritance. The lesson for us is to refuse to be intimidated by the social norms of our times if they stand in the way of our God-given calling. Even when things seem impossible, we should not let obstacles stand in our way. Now, chapter 8 takes us back to the tribe of Benjamin, who had already been mentioned in chapter 7. But in this chapter, we have a more detailed genealogy, which includes Saul, the first king of Israel. The Benjaminites produced 4 significant people, only 2 of whom are mentioned here. Because of the others, one was a woman and the other an apostle. I've named them on the handout for you. There are some interesting names amongst those listed in 1 Chronicles chapter 8, of which I'm just going to point out 2. In verse 33, we see Ner is the father of Kish. Elsewhere, he's called Abiel. Scholars believe Ner was his nickname. It means lamp or torch, and perhaps he was given the nickname because he shone with holiness. And then in verse 34, you will see that Jonathan was the father of Merib-Baal. This was another name for Mephibosheth, whom David brought into the royal palace in order to keep the covenant that he had made with Jonathan. There is much more contained within these pages, so as you read through them, give time to think about the lives and families of these very real people who still now impact our lives. See you in the next session.